So I thought it would be useful just to recap a bit from what Scott had said last time about the diatonic world, and the chords and the scales and the way in which those things are made up. For me, if you have a question you'd like to ask, and it feels like it's the right time to do it as I go past it, I absolutely don't mind stopping and going back into something if that makes more sense than trying to wait to the end and try and remember what it was you were going to say. So if you've got a question, maybe Scott, could you keep an eye on the hands, because I haven't got everybody on my screen, and just stop me and say, what the heck did that mean? Or that doesn't match with what I thought you meant last time. So anything like that, anything we can try and make clear as we go along, I'd like to do if possible. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay, good. So I thought it might be interesting to have a look at why we have to deal with these chords and things, where they've come from, how they've kind of evolved. We talked about last time about the kind of strange jargon and real language of working with chords and how we label them, how we add numbers to them, how we add different names and stuff to them. And it's quite interesting to just look at the background in terms of the Western European harmony, which is what we're mostly dealing with. I'll talk a bit about where we've been with it later on, but we're talking about creating a harmony structures, creating harmony rules in a relatively small part of the world. And this was created by a relatively small but really powerful group of people. And if you think about who was working in Latin in the Middle Ages, and who was writing stuff down and who was recording stuff, you can get quite quickly to a natural point, which is that there were small numbers of men, usually men, in large buildings writing stuff down, which became rules for the people around them. Now you can call that, it could be monastic, or it could be religiously based, or it could be state based, but nonetheless things got very, very written down quite quickly, and that became the rules. They became kind of what you're supposed to do. So you're supposed to sing in a certain way. You were supposed to sing certain things at certain times of day. You were told when to sing a certain part of a particular prayer, for example, or a certain celebration. It was all very kind of fixed. And if you look back through the ancient documents of kind of like Western discoveries in churches and abbeys and universities and castles and what have you, you can find some really quite intricate, very early script of how people related what was supposed to be done. And there were rules, there were very definitely rules. And the way that people got paid was if they followed the rules, was if they actually wrote the right thing for whoever it was who was asking was asking for the work to be done. I'm just looking at, yep. Okay, cool. Sorry, I was just checking the messages, but it's all right. Yeah, have you got your hand up, Photo?
Yeah, only to say that there are at least two people telling me they're in the waiting room. Helen and Leslie.
Yeah, that's strange because Zoom is telling me I've got 19 people, none in waiting room. So I'm not sure what to do about that. Maybe ask them to go out and
I've already
rejoin.
suggested they leave and come back in. I'll
Yeah,
get them to
I,
do that.
I am keeping
Sorry,
an eye on it. No
Yeah,
problem.
okay, not to worry. If as long as somebody's keeping an eye on that, then that's great. Yeah, so we ended up with in Western Europe, and I'm going to keep saying that because we are talking about a relatively small amount of the planet. but people started to write certain stuff to get paid and to get sustained and to get the patronage and to get the kind of like the gigs, basically. And that harmony has come down the line towards us. So obviously there were people who challenged it. There were people who kind of wanted to kind of combat the rules, fight against the rules. And it's interesting to go back over history and go, well, actually, the people who we remember, the people who made it into the history books, are often people who challenged and kind of like broke what the establishment was saying they had to write. But from our perspective, what it's done is kind of started a tradition. It started a kind of snowball of what we live with now as kind of Western European harmony. And it's sort of governed by who wrote it down. I suppose that's what I'm saying. All these rules have been kind of like handed down a bit like history by the people who wrote it, who were usually the winners, or the people who were kind of at the top of their various community trees of one sort or another. So we have we're writing songs against the backdrop of a very, very long tradition of harmony and melody and rhythmic writing, which is actually quite sort of specific in nature. And what it's done is it's thrown up quite a lot of anomalies, quite a lot of things that we maybe need to know about in order to break them. But some of the things we'll just kind of railroad past. And in a bit, I'm just going to talk about how we can look at that and kind of unpick some of the kind of formalizations of harmony. While all this was going on, there were hundreds of thousands and millions of people making music that nobody ever took any notice of. Obviously, I mean, we can see in paintings, we can see in books, we can see in the kind of like records of the time that there were people playing music in the fields, in the streets, in the towns, in the taverns, in the pubs. Everybody was kind of doing it, but it just wasn't written down in the same way. It got stolen, of course. The formal composers used to write down, they make whole suites of very expensive sounding music out of the local dance tunes, or they would kind of like take a format from what they'd heard in the marketplace and rework it for their own uses. But essentially, we have an unrecorded history of what was really going on. The first time we start to hear it is when the recording industry kicks in, or the very, very primitive field recordings of folk music. But these were taken against this backdrop of the written, of the transcribed. So I thought I'm going to try and play you something. I hope you can hear this. I want to just play you a bit of a field recording of an Appalachian singer. Scott, shout me down if nobody can hear this, but if you can have a listen to this.
It's some folks says there's a flower you can find will cure false love and ease your mind. And out in these flowers I made my bed, and out in these leaves a pillar for my head. It's a gathered red and a gathered blue, until I got my apron full. But little did I think what love would do.
Okay, so there you have a very early primitive, quite primitive field recording of a woman singing in the fields, and it's a relatively good recording. It's better than some. However, what starts to happen when people try and write it down? When they take that recording with the best transcribing musical skills in the world to try and write down every single subtlety of what that woman was singing, and to not dismiss it, and this is why I think I get a little bit of a high horse, not to dismiss it because it doesn't fit into the rules, is a mistake. However, for the sake of the transcription and for the sake of the recording and for the sake of the collection, we often get to a point where you can imagine how the people who knew how to write, the people who knew how to transcribe, and the people who had the skill and the experience to do that, you can imagine them actually making that fit their own world, their own rules. So they would square stuff up. You would end up, I mean, God knows what time signature that was in, that lady was singing. I mean, it was kind of cool. It was great. And it had meter, it had rhythm, it had melody, it had all the things that we associate with it. But as soon as it starts to get written down, as soon as people try and record it and collect it, it gets to a point where perhaps that loses its authenticity. And the music that we write in the name of sort of popular song, as it were, now owes as much to that tradition as it does to the stuff that has come down in terms of the rule books. Does that make sense? So we are kind of working in this kind of strange tension between popular music, as it were, and the rules that have been laid down for us in terms of harmony. So all the harmony rules and to a certain extent, the melodic rules and the rhythmic rules have been kind of like created by a certain number of people. And I would just say again, this is about Europe, all right? They're not quite the same in other parts of the world, but similar things happen. So our habit of collecting and categorizing and turning things into something has kind of like pervaded into the recording world. So we now sit with our guitar or our piano or our computer or whatever it was, and we listen to a song we quite like to learn, and it's come through a whole process to get to us of a kind of compromise, if you like, from the original songwriter to our ears. And of course, what we do is we listen to it, we try and work out the chords, or we try and work out the melody, we try and work out how it goes, and then we make it for ourselves. And sometimes we've got the right instruments, sometimes we haven't. We don't care. We're just going to sort of own it and turn that song into our own version. Nonetheless, the recording industry and the publishing industry have, in some senses, and I would say in quite influential senses, told us what that song's supposed to sound like. So if you listen to an album, if you listen to an artist that you like or an artist you don't like, what you're hearing is somebody else's idea, not yours, of what that song should sound like. And it's very easy to get caught up in how well you play that song or how well you sing that song in relation to the original. So if I don't sound like George Ezra, I can't sing pop songs. If I don't sound like Mick Jagger, I can't perform those songs. And as songwriters, it's a context that we, I think, find ourselves kind of like we can get bogged down in. So I think it's important to kind of like know where all this stuff is coming from, not so that we can break the rules, but just so that we can like be part of the tradition, really. Because some of us like to write songs down, some of us like to record them, some of us write them down in tabs, some of them write down with chords. Some of us don't write them down at all, but try and remember it all. God knows how you do that if you're one of them. But it's a very important aspect of being a songwriter, which is to know that the world that you're inhabiting. I don't want to scare anybody with it because there are different ways in which you can relate to that world, but it is quite a big one and it's quite an influential one, even if you don't know very much about it. It's still there in the background, in the context that you're part of. So wherever you go, and I'm going to flip out of Europe for a minute, wherever you go, there are different rules. So if you go to North Indian classical music, there are rules there. If you go to Indonesia for gamelan music, which is something I know a bit about, some of you know, there are very definitely rules there. If you go to Latin America, there are rules there. There are rules everywhere that are being used to make sure the music fits with whatever the context is. But of course, there are always people challenging that. So it's okay to challenge it. It's not a problem to do that unless you want to fit in with a particular regime, and that brings its own kind of nightmare. So they've all and the other thing I was just going to say is that they've all found their way into our kind of Western toolkit. So the recording industry has given us, and media has given us access to a lot of music that we wouldn't necessarily hear. I suppose that's an obvious thing to say, but nonetheless, it gives us source material, but one person's source material is another person's cultural, sort of is another person's theft. I'm here to say that we've all stolen stuff. Okay, we've all taken stuff from other musics and tried to make them work for ourselves. I think that's okay. As a writer, you've sort of got license to magpie. You've got license to kind of like go and have a listen to stuff and go, oh yeah, I like that. I like putting that together with this, and what they're doing there with that kind of like chord sequence is really cool, but I'd rather like to do a different kind of melody. All that you can give yourself permission to do that. The key thing I would say is that you need to be able to continue through whatever it is, whatever phase it is that you're writing in. So if you start writing yourself like 3-chord tricks or riff-based music or songs that kind of sound a bit similar over the course of the next sort of 3 or 4 songs, they all sound a bit the same. Please don't let that stop you. Please feel free to just kind of work through that groove, work through that. I mean, some people call it a groove. It's not far from a groove to a rut, to be honest. But if you can keep going through it and come out the other side, you'll find that the music is kind of like flowing again. And so many of us try and get the right thing first time, or try and get something we're proud of first time, or second time, or third time even. And that's only going to happen if you keep the kind of almost mechanics of the songwriting going forward. You've got this huge, great tradition on your back of all the music you've heard and all the music that's been recorded and all the music on the radio or online or whatever. You've got it all going on in your heads, and it's hard sometimes to forget that you're not kind of obliged to it, and you're not. You can do whatever you like. You can make the music that you want to make. But what I'm hoping to be able to say to you tonight is that there are bits of stuff that's gone on around us forever and ever that we can cherry pick, if you like, or we can go and have a listen to, and we can go, oh, well, I'll have some of that and I'll have a bit of that. And it's all right to do that because you've got your own kind of voice on that. Any questions so far? No? Cool. Okay, good. So, ironically and somewhat kind of like confusingly, I'm now going to talk a bit about having a listen to different kind of sorts of music with their own rules. So when you set out to write your songs, if you want to write a funk song, there are particular kind of guidelines, shall we say. Bootsy Collins famously said, "You've got to hit the one." So, and if you're going to if you want to write in the style of any genre, there will be influences that you can go and have a listen to. If you play with a guitar, or if you play with a piano, or something that plays more than one note at a time, then the chances are you're going to find yourself trying to work out what the chords are. You're going to sit there with your piano or your guitar and go, okay, well, you start that, we start with that, and then they go to there, and you kind of either you do it by ear or you get it online and you get a kind of like an instant hit of what it is that you want to play. And there it is again, usually written down on a screen, in a book, somewhere, showing you what you're supposed to do. Now, when you write for yourself, that's not there. That feeling of kind of what it's supposed to be like isn't there anymore. You're working in, it's not a vacuum because you've got all that stuff going on in your head, but you're working in a different way. You're working from a kind of an open standpoint, a blank sheet of paper, if you like. And let's face it, there's nothing more scary than a blank sheet of paper. And I think I should say now that I feel very strongly that there are as many ways of writing songs as there are people who write them. There is no given way of doing it. You can follow all the lines of the rule of the third line, or the rule of the resolving tonic, or whatever it is. You can follow all those rules to the letter, and what you create still might not make any sense. It still might not be as funky as something you could have done one afternoon with a guitar and when you weren't feeling too good. So please don't feel as though you have to get it right first time. I'm sure a lot of you who've written songs before have got notebooks full of ideas, stuff you thought was going to be okay, and it's sort of like petered out and it's kind of stopped being any good somewhere along the line. And maybe you go back to those notebooks, maybe you don't. Maybe you've got a stack of them in a corner somewhere and go, you know what, I really should go back and have a look over that stuff at some point and see if any of it's any good. Chances are you've moved on. So I would say to you, if you can, and again, I don't want to sort of like lay it on too thick, but if you can, get stuff writ before you move on to the next thing. Having 5 or 6 on the go at the time has never been a good thing for me. I've always had to get to the end of something, even if I didn't like it. I've always got to the point where I've gone, okay, well, that's at least 2 verses, a chorus, and a bit of a bridge, but thankfully I can leave that behind. I call it, look out, Mum, I'm falling over, stick it in a cupboard and never think about it again. And that's moving on to my next song or my next idea or something else that's going to help me get to the next stage. So sure, I mean, we all keep notebooks of one sort or another. We all keep kind of records of what we're doing, but it's really important to kind of like work through them, get stuff written, get it written and get it out there, get it out of your head before you get on to the next thing. So in a slightly paradoxical way, what I'd just like to say is quite a good exercise to pick an artist or a genre or a style and see what it is that makes it work. If you're a guitar player, you know, play along to stuff. I'm sure you do this anyway. I'm just kind of like hopefully reassuring you that it's okay to do this stuff. If you're a guitar player, play along with stuff, work out what the changes are. Piano player, singer, sax player, flautist, whatever it is that you do, please feel free, as if you needed permission, to play along with stuff that's on the radio. But as you're doing that, you're going to assimilate a lot of stuff that you can use for your own writing, okay? There's nothing worse than having it in your head and nowhere else. If it's in your head, you're walking the dog or you're strolling around or something and you can't get it out of your head onto a phone recording or onto a piece of paper or into some other external medium, then it will clog up what might come next. The other thing that a friend of mine once said to me, which I found really useful, was it's okay to write stuff you don't like. So if you're kind of like working through something and it really isn't working for you, and as a person you feel like, I shouldn't really be writing stuff like this. This is crap. This isn't working for me at all. That's okay. Again, work through it, get through it. In fact, in some ways, it's quite a good exercise to try and write something you don't like, because it forces you into areas you wouldn't normally go. But it's okay to, again, I'm just saying the same thing, I guess, over and over again, work through stuff. And then the other thing is, if you can spare time as a sort of songwriter and as a, you know, in your busy lives, it's quite a cool idea, is it not? I'm sure a lot of you do this already, is to follow the spiral, follow the trail back, if that's the right term, from the music you're listening to where that music came from. So if you're listening to current artists or a particular genre that's producing material now, how did that come about? Where did that go? And actually, the net is really good for stuff like that. You can find out who the resources are, who the source material were for particular artists that you're listening to. Where did that come from? What influences did they kind of like draw up? And look at who the producers are, look at who the labels are, look at who the publishers are, and find out what the world is that they got their ideas from. Sometimes that's as fruitful as anything else. I couldn't believe it when I don't know if some of you will know Betty Davis, not the actress, but Miles Davis's wife, Betty, who's the funkiest funkiest artist you're likely to come across. And I never really come across her until I went back through Miles into other things that he was doing at the time and found Betty Davis albums, and I just couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe how really kind of like fundamental her stuff sounds, and it was really exciting, apart from anything else, really exciting to find that stuff out. So all that stuff's going on. People you like, people you don't like, all the stuff that's happening around, and you can pick and cherry pick whatever you like from all that. So some of the rules that we might like to play with, I think maybe playing with them rather than breaking them is possibly a slightly more reassuring way to think about it. So whether we like it or not, we've got this whole stuff going on in our background, and we have to kind of pick our way through that into some of the techniques, or I'm going to pick our way through that into some of the techniques that I find useful when I'm starting to write, and to try and stop myself falling into some of the traps that I feel around me most of the time. Some of this is going to be very, very straightforward, and some of it might be new. So please flag up if you want me to kind of go back over any of the kind of technical stuff that I might be getting into. First of all, we talked a bit last time about how we create the sort of basis, the basis of our harmony and our melodies and what have through diatonic. One of the things we didn't talk about, which I'm going to talk about now, is rhythm. Now, there are three, in Western European music, there are three main building blocks, whatever the music is that you're making, and they are rhythm, melody, and harmony. If you concentrate on one of those, then the other two might take a bit of a back seat. If you write a tune first, then the rhythm and the harmony come behind that. If you get your rhythm track down first, then the harmony and the melody often come over the top. But essentially, when we're writing, when we're composing, we're finding a way of mixing those three elements. And it's quite a cool idea. Another little exercise, another little thing that I find quite interesting for people to do is to lift out one of those. Lift out one of those and see what you can do with the two left over. Doesn't matter which one. You take melody out, probably the easiest one, weirdly, to get rid of, and work with just rhythm and harmony. You have a different kind of starting point than if you take harmony out and just work with melody and rhythm. And any of those, if you concentrate on one of them, then you can sort of build the other two around it. Okay, so the three kind of fit together. They fit together really, really well. That's what we do. We fit those three things together. But without one, or concentrating on one, you put pressure on that one, and that can create a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more of a relationship with one of those three strands than perhaps you wanted to start with. So if you find yourself used to, and I expect a lot of us do this, a lot of us start with a chord sequence. We bang out a few chords, go, oh, they fit quite nicely together, those four chords or those three chords, they fit all right. So that's your harmony sorted. What happens if you don't start with a chord sequence? What happens if you start with, I don't know, a drum loop or a clap rhythm, or you start singing, or you start with a melody line and try and find a way of recording that either onto your phone or somehow so that you can have it playing while you work out how to harmonize it. So again, take away the crutch, if you like, take away what you always do and try starting from a different point. So start from the rhythm games, start from a rhythm loop, start from something like that rather than a chord sequence. And while we're on the subject of rhythm, not far away from rhythm to tempo, how often do we fall into crotchet equals 120? We sort of naturally walk at it. We kind of like think in it. We kind of walk around in it. We sort of we hear that 120 with us all the time. So again, another way of kind of like playing with that kind of natural rule, if you like, is to just force yourself to write something fast. Say, well, I'm going to write something fast for a change. Middle tempo, yeah, of course. But that's probably to do with much with how fast you can think about the ideas as it is to do anything else. Don't worry, if you're just going to write something fast, you probably don't need very much material in terms of anything else apart from just the speed. And you can pick up that as your starting block. Yeah. So play with the idea of tempo. Play with the idea of is this song going to kind of groove at this particular pace or at that particular pace? Think about the rhythm. Think about the feel that you're trying to create rather than just the chord shape or the tune. It's very, very important. And a lot of people will say to you, if you don't get the tempo right, a lot of producers I've worked with said, if you don't get the tempo right, it's no point carrying on. Once the pace is there, once the pulse is there, then everything else kind of fits together really nicely. If you've done any rehearsing at all and you've tried to practice songs slower than you think they're supposed to go, you know how frustrating that can be. And it's when you pick it up and get it into the groove that it's sort of like that you know it at is when it comes good. Okay, so that's about the speed. Do we understand what we mean by time signature? So time signature, just briefly, is if you say to somebody, well, this is in 4, or if this is in 6, or this is in 2, it's essentially the way that you feel the rhythm, the kind of main count, if you like. And perhaps we are all familiar with 1, 2, 3, 4, go. And that's our count in, and that's how it goes. Unless you're a dancer, in which case it's 5, 6, 7, 8, and don't ask me why. But essentially, you have a count in, and then you all know what speed you're supposed to play at. There are people who don't hear that counting. we've probably all worked with some people whose idea of a count isn't quite the same as our own, but that nonetheless is how you create the speed for the band or for your writing. So knowing what your BPM is and knowing what the count is knowing what the BPM thing is one thing, that's the speed. Knowing what the count is another. That's the feel for it. And everything's fine. Everything's fine because you're kind of grooving along, usually in 4 or 2. When people start getting confused is when it slips into shuffle or swing. So your subdivision, if you like, you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and you're dead straight. As soon as it gets into dunky, 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 which is what some of us refer to as shuffle or swing, then it can get confusing for people to know where they should be playing. We tend to feel it naturally. It's not something I want to get too heavily into, but you should, as a songwriter, you should know whether you're writing straight or swung. Because as soon as you start explaining it to somebody, as soon as you start playing it to somebody else, that's the first thing they're going to pick up on, especially if they're the drummer, but not just the drummer. And swung is basically the subdivision into 3. So instead of thinking of 1, 2, 3, 4 as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you're actually thinking of it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Jacketa, 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 jacketa. Yeah. And that's where you get the chumpa donka 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 thing. Blues, rock, anything that's got that kind of shuffle feel, shuffle beat is swung as opposed to straight. Funk, usually straight. Blues, often swung. Yeah. Not, please don't quote me on that. It didn't always go like that. And some of the best effect you can get in terms of rhythm and playing with tempo is when you get friendly with the and. So you're thinking about 1, 2, 3, 4, and a lot of people, a lot of teachers, a lot of band leaders will use an and. They'll go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and that immediately gives you access to a more to more opportunities for rhythm. So if you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, throw an and in, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and that's where your ska offbeat is. And that's where the reggae beat is. That and is a really, really cool place to live for a bit. And if you're thinking about kind of, I don't know, trying melodies, for example, starting melodies on an and rather than starting melodies on a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4, you'll find yourself going, oh, hang on, wait a minute, that suggests different kind of different ways of working with the lyric. You know, starting a lyric on the second half of a beat rather at the beginning of a beat is a really interesting thing to start with. You'll probably be doing it naturally. I'm just trying to point out that you can find your way of getting to these things in a technical way. So once you've worked out what your time signature is or your feel is, then you've got that and the pace of the track that you want to write, then you kind of like feel confident that you can move in it, you can sort of walk around and kind of get a sense of how that thing's going to work. Incidentally, for those of you who are interested in it, if you see a time signature, which is like a 4 over a 4, looks like 4 quarters, that's essentially the top number is the number of beats, and the bottom number is the sort of beats they are. So a 4 over 4 is 4 quarter notes, or crotchets as we call them in this part of the world. 3 over an 8 would be 3 half notes, eighths, quavers in a bar. You're usually going to come across a 4 or an 8 on the bottom of that equation. You might come across a 2, a 4, or a 6, or possibly a 12 on the top. And that tells you how many there are. That clear? Okay, cool. So that subdivision, done that, critical truth meter. So yeah, so as we start to write, we're probably going to start thinking about the chords. I thought it was really interesting last time when we started talking about language of chords. And Scott said, we're talking about how we build the chords up using the triad. So I'm just going to sort of expand on that a little bit. So when we work with a triad, we normally think of ourselves as working with 3 notes. Now I'm going to flip my camera here and hopefully you can see what I'm doing. No, I'm going to flip my camera here and hopefully you can see what I'm doing. There's so much open here, it's crazy. There we go. Right, so somewhere there is, switch cameras, there it is. Okay, can you see? No, you can't, can you?
Can you stop screen sharing, Nick?
Can I stop or start?
Stop, and
Stop,
that
yeah.
might help us see what you're doing.
Oh, yeah, beg your pardon. Thanks, Photo. Let me just... you don't need that. Sorry, folks. Switch camera. To video. Oh, for some reason my my setup is using my iPhone camera, which is over in the back of my jacket. Right. See the keyboard? Yep. So, no, you can't hear it. For goodness sake. The thing is, Photo, I have to share my screen so that I can hear, so you can hear my. Yeah. Bear with. Mm. Can you hear me? You can't hear the piano, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Hold on a sec. Oh dear. Okay, I'm getting slightly lost because I'm trying to share the screen, which does mean I can share the sound with you, but at the moment it's not playing. So I apologize while I work out exactly why that is. Okay, share. Screens, yeah, share. Here we go. Can you hear that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thanks. So, where was I? Yeah, okay, so starting to deal with the language of the chords. So yeah, we talked about the diatonic last time, which is essentially working with the way in which our diatonic world is built. So we are working with the, let's see what I'm having. We are working with this kind of scale. Yeah, so we all recognize that. That's absolutely fine. And we talked about how those scales are built. We talked about what the kind of rules are, again, of how that scale is made. So in a major scale, we have the and our chords follow that scale. So we have a C, I'm working in C as most pianists always will. So we start with a C chord and then we go to a D minor chord. And then we harmonize that further up to an E minor chord. And the next chord is an F, and then a G chord, and then that A minor chord, and then the last one, which is that strange diminished chord off the B. Yeah. Now that is using all the notes that come in that scale. As soon as we start messing with the notes that come in that scale, that gives us access to a different kind of different way of doing things. Okay. So I just want to make sure you can still see my hand. Is that right?
Yep, you're back.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. It's weird because I can't actually see myself. So in the building of the major key stuff, what's quite cool is to start thinking about how you add different notes into those chords, okay? Now, the first one we started looking at last time, in again, we're talking about a major key. We're starting to add the seventh. So in a C scale, you might think that that's that note there, the seventh note. But convention tells us that it's actually a flattened seventh. And that gives us that. Okay, that's what a seventh sounds like. If you want to sharpen that seventh, and this is the start of working with the different numbers, you get a slightly jazzier sound. So again, we are pushing what we can add to the triad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then that 7. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call a major seventh. Sometimes written as a triangle, sometimes written MAJ7. That is a major seventh. The next one we look at is the D minor, if you remember. We're going up to the D minor chord. And we add the seventh, and that gives us this sound. That is a naturally occurring seventh there. All right. So we've gone and we go to the E minor, and again, we add the seventh note. And just by perhaps starting to mix those chords, C major seventh, D minor seventh, C major seventh, D minor seventh. That'll hold it for a while. That'll hold it for a while. If you add the other ingredients like melody and rhythm to that, you don't have to go far. Okay, so using the accidentals, the added numbers to the notes, to the chords, is a really handy way of pushing the envelope a bit. I also just like to say that when we talk about chords, we're talking about sevenths and ninths and flattened fifths and stuff like that. We're talking about a voicing, a way of playing those chords, which is pretty much left to the player. If a singer sees a ninth or is asked to sing a ninth, they're not going to sing. They can't. They can only sing one note at a time. So they're going to sing the interval of the ninth. Yeah, that's what a singer or a sax player or a melody instrument player understands as a ninth or as a seventh or a third or a fifth, is the interval. When we're talking about it with chords, we talk about it as a shape. Yeah, and guitar players fall into shapes in different ways, as Scott was saying last time, than piano players do. Piano players play with different sorts of shapes. So as we want to, if we want to, we don't have to, of course we don't have to do any of this, but if we want to, the next one that was mentioned last time was the ninth, which is 2 away up there. Now this all starts to get very difficult to play if you're going to try and play all the notes. And if you're writing, you don't really want to be bothered about trying to work out how you play a C minor ninth. If you just want to use it as part of your kind of chord sequence. So finding a way of using these chords, which means that it's not kind of like dependent on your being able to play them, is quite useful. Yeah, I would suggest that although it is perfectly possible to write things you can't play, if you can't play it, it does make writing quite difficult if you're on your own. Yeah. So the next one that we look at is inside the triad. Okay. So we're working there with our major triad. By flattening the third, that makes it a minor triad. Okay. So our minor triad is also available to there are accidentals and add-ons available to us in the minor triad. minor seventh, for example. So essentially, when you're starting to voice your chords, and we're working with major scales here, what the scale gives us is a sequence, if you like, of root notes. Root note D, root note E, root note F, G, A, and then B. So the chord is always named after the root note. So even if you've got a B flat, sorry, C at the bottom there, and all the other notes are like that, kind of weird crunchy chord, you probably will see that it will be named from the C. So as you're writing, remember that you're kind of writing, the root note is the kind of name of the chord. It's the first name of the chord, if you like, the key name of the chord. So in major scales, that's how we build it. Does that make sense? Anybody want me to go over anything again? Okay, we cool? Yeah, it's difficult to know because I'm looking at a blank screen. So wherever you're playing, whatever kind of like sequence you're trying to use, then that's the access that you've got. You've got access to those notes through that. It starts to get kind of cookie when you start thinking about minor scales. Okay, now a minor scale, and we're going to sort of start with the A because it gives us essentially the same notes, but starting on an A. That's a minor scale. It's called a natural minor scale. Now, for reasons far too long to go into right now, we very rarely use our natural minor scale these days. We normally use what's called a harmonic minor scale, and that's with a raised seventh. So in an A minor scale, raised seventh. And that's what you will hear most of the time. And our one chord is a minor chord. Our two chord is the kind of strange one. Our three chord is a major chord. Our fourth chord is a minor chord. Our fifth chord, because of the raised seventh, is a major chord. And sixth chord is a major, and then G is a major. So the chords available to you in a minor key, starting from an A minor, using the root as the naming note, A minor, B diminished, more of which later, C major, D minor, E major, F major, G major, and then we're back to A. Invariably, we work with chord 1, chord 4, which is our D minor, and then our chord 5, which is our E major, A minor. So if you could just listen to that sequence. That's 1, 4, chord 4, chord 5, chord 1. Okay. There is another minor chord, another minor scale, which you might come across, which is the melodic minor. I won't go into it too much. I just want to let you know that it's there. If I were you, I'd stay away from it. It's different going up than it is coming down, and it's a nightmare. So just kind of hang in on the harmonic minor. If you ever need to know the difference between any minors and minors, it's fine. The natural minor is the one that, strictly speaking, sticks to the key signature, but the one you're probably working in is the harmonic minor, which is with the raised seventh, which in the key of A minor is going to be a G sharp. Okay? So it's quite a good idea to get used to this idea of 1-4-5. Okay, you probably play any songs you're used to playing. Your chances are you're using chord 1, chord 4, and chord 5. It's the classic shape. Let's do, can you see me there? C, G, back to G, C. Okay, 1-4-5. In the minor equivalent, starting with an A minor, 1, 4, 5, 1. Okay, so 1-4-5 is the kind of main building block that a lot of people start with, and it's made up of the chords corresponding to the first, fourth, and fifth notes of the scale, of whichever scale you're working in. If somebody says to you a piece is in G, the chances are you're going to need a G, obviously, a fourth chord, the C, and the D. Yeah, 1-4-5. There will be others, but the chances are that's what you're going to need. Okay. The relationship between the minor and the major keys is when it starts to get, major and minor chords, is when you start to kind of add new dynamics, if you like, to your chord sequences. So you can work with the C, and if you go to the A minor, which is essentially chord 6 in the C, and then an F, and then a G, how many times have we heard that sequence? So those basic chord sequences are sequences which you will have heard already, and you've probably played 1,000 times. And when you start to write, it's quite cool to just kind of like vamp with something you're quite familiar with and see what you can do to stretch that. So instead of maybe going from the 1 to the 2, to the 1 to the 6, the A minor, what's it like if you go from the 1 to the A, but make it the major? Gives you a whole different dynamic. That leads you somewhere else. Okay, so it's entirely up to you how you want to play with how the chords work. But it's a good idea to know where it's useful to be. Yeah? So, inversions. We mentioned these last time briefly. An inversion is basically how you voice the chord. Now, guitar players, piano players, again, this applies to people who are playing chord instruments. A C chord, the major triad, doesn't have to just be played like that. It can be played like this. Same notes, different order. Or this one. Which means that when you're writing something, you might put an inversion into your writing. By that I mean this. If you have a C chord, you can have any of those notes in the bass. You don't have to have a C in the bass. So we're moving into the idea of a different bass note than the root note. That's the root note. However, you can have a C with a G in the bass, and an E. And it creates a different kind of harmony. There's the strong one with a G. It gives you a different kind of feel to the chord. It makes it less powerful. So you can kind of use it in a different way. Okay. So your inversion, if you want to think about it, often looks like the chord you want, and I'm using C a lot, so we'll stick with that, then a dash or a forward slash, and then the note you want in the bass. Okay, so you got C with a G in the bass. Where it gets kind of cool is that when you move the bass note without moving the chord, so your bass note moves, but your chords don't. So C, pick a note, B flat. Down to the next note, down to the G. So a bass player will recognize that. Keep the same chord though. And it starts to create a different kind of tension and a different kind of sequence. You're still using a C chord, but you're moving the bass note. C, B flat, and depending on how adventurous you want to get with those bass note moves, you're moving into the world of sort of kind of Beatlesy type stuff. It's a very, very common and quite cool way of starting to develop the bass line away from just playing the root notes. Okay, so you can play with the idea of using different sequences where the bass notes come in and move the transitions. Anybody want me to go over anything else about that? No? All good? So the other thing is just a bit of grammar about when you're writing in D, for example, which is, sorry, running out of scale. It's a sharp key. It's got an F sharp in it. So please, when you're writing in, and this is, some people get confused about whether it's an F sharp or a G flat or an A sharp or a B flat. Essentially, if you're writing in a scale, using a scale which has sharps in it, it's called a sharp key, and equally, obviously, possibly the others are flat keys. And so you can just call it an E flat as opposed to a D sharp. So don't write D sharp if you're using a flat keys. That makes sense? You probably wouldn't anyway, but it sometimes can get a bit confusing when people say, well, it's the same as a D flat. Well, it isn't, because you're playing in E, yeah? Or playing in the sharp key. Okay, so when we're writing chords, we often write the chord name, and then we add the 7th or the 9th. Something else to remember is if you, strictly speaking, write a 9th, for example, it implies that the 7th is also in the played in as well. Unless you see a symbol, sometimes you'll see a symbol with no 9 or no 7 or whatever. The strictly speaking, if you write a C9 chord, you're expecting to hear the 7th and the 9th, which is everything. You can leave things out just by saying so. No 7th or no 11th or whatever. Just in case you come across that. That can get a bit iffy. All right. So when we're playing with chord sequences, we've got the chords that are available to us in the scale that we're using. But of course, what we like to, and we've also got the idea of this moving bass line. Doesn't have to be in tones. And currently I'm just working with a major scale. You can equally do it off a D, start with a D minor, for example. Moving, bass line. And very quickly you get to that kind of sequence. And all I'm doing is keeping the D shape in my right hand and moving my left hand. So if you're writing from a melodic point of view, thinking about giving your band or giving your instrumentalists or working with the idea of a moving part rather than a change of chord can be quite exciting. A moving part inside a chord can keep your musical interest going really, really well. So for example, we start with a C triad, and just by simply shifting that note down to that note there, inside the chord, you get this effect. Suspended second. Same thing with this one. Inside the chord, moving the note. If you've played like a D chord with your little finger going down on a guitar, that's exactly the same thing there. Making those little suspensions and those little bits of interest inside the chord can be really, really useful. Equally outside the chord. Working on single notes moving rather than a whole chord shape shifting can give you quite a lot of material that you weren't necessarily expecting to have access to, because all you're doing is shifting your shape a little bit more than a whole chord. It's quite good in Latin music. I don't know if you can see this because the so from a major seventh to the minor seventh to the sixth, and then back again. You're just holding the whole C and just moving one of the notes inside that chord. And you'll find that some keys do that nicer than others. Some shapes do it nicer than others. Okay. Anything that people want me to go over again? All right. So while we're thinking about these these chords from our scale notes, why not think about how the scale notes, so we've got the scale note chords, and they'll all work as we've done before. Yeah, really nicely. It's not far from there to starting to think about different notes as our root notes than those that are available to us in the scale. So for example, this third, which is a very strong and important note in any chord, if we sort of use that as a root note for a major chord and add that into our repertoire, if you like, we end up with this. C, E minor. Now we're going to go to an E flat. And back. And again. Or if we jump straight there. Okay, so we get lots of different ways of trying things out using the notes that are available to us as root notes. and then move from that to notes that we didn't necessarily think. What happens if you go to an A flat? Always working with the same sorts of shapes, if that makes sense. So that's how we might start to add things to our chords within the notes that we're working with, within the scales that we're working with. We've also looked at what we name those shapes. So there are some, and we've talked about some typical examples. The next thing I want to talk about is the idea of a mode. Now, modes are talked about a lot, and we've already actually talked about two of them, and that is the Ionian mode, which is our major scale, and an Aeolian mode, which is our minor scale. Or with a raised seventh. Okay. If you start on a piano from a white note, then play all the white notes up to the octave, you will get a different, what we call mode. So D to D is the Dorian mode. All right. Now you can find these online anywhere. Anything if you're interested in working with modes, and why would we be? We'll talk about that in a minute. It's the intervals from D to D. Forget major, forget minor. We're now talking about modes, which is a different way of thinking about sequences of notes, scales, if you like. The next one, the E, and that sounds like this. Very, very common for us to use a Dorian mode, especially in improvisation, not least because it's all the white notes on the piano. Sounds great. The next one, E to E, is called the Phrygian mode, and that's Phrygian. All right. It's also sometimes known as the Spanish scale, and you can hear if you start playing around with it. It has a slightly sort of Hispanic sound to it. I don't believe it myself too much because there are other things you can do to sound Spanish, but it's sometimes referred to as a Spanish scale. That's the Phrygian mode. The F to F is Lydian. The G to G is Mixolydian. A to A, as I've already said, is Aeolian. And then the B to B is Locrian. Now, I'm just saying that because they're there. And if you want to give yourself a kind of give yourself a little kind of change of direction, working with modes can be quite cool. It is a good idea not to think about modes and chords in the same way. Modes are sequences of notes. Chords are notes played all at the same time. And if you're going to use modes, you will probably get more out of it if you work with a drone or with a pedal note, which is essentially a sustained note. So if you're going to play so I'm working in the Lydian. As soon as I add the third, try and formalize my left hand into an F major chord. It creates a different kind of clash. So if you're thinking about working with modes, I would recommend that you work with drones, two notes or an octave note, to give you your kind of base, yeah, to work from. And don't forget, the Lydian mode, for example, isn't just F to F on the keyboard. It's an easy way to remember it, but it's that sequence of notes for the scale. So it's tone, 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 semitone, tone, tone, semitone. Wherever you start, you can start a mode on any note you like. And if you listen to the music of the Middle East, or a lot of the music in a lot of the South American music, and North American music from the southern states, you will hear a lot of modal work. The Dorian mode is a very, very common in folk music. Scarborough Fair's a Dorian tune. Okay, cool. So, everybody okay? I feel as though I'm kind of loading you with a whole load of stuff, and I'm not sure whether we should just sort of like have a moment for questions. Would that be a good idea?
Yeah, let's do it.
Anybody want me to go back over anything? I'll try and flick my camera back so you're not looking at my keyboard all the time.
I think Tim might have a question.
Yeah. Tim.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Great.
Hi.
My new microphone's working. Great.
Hooray.
Hiya, yeah. So my question is, I can come up with a chord progression, and from that I can develop a melody.
Yeah.
But I can't do it the other way around. So if I've got a melody in my head, how do I find the right chord progression to fit over it?
Okay. Have you got a way of identifying what notes you're singing?
Well, I play a bit of guitar, so I would try and fathom it out from there. I don't play piano.
Sure. Okay. So what I would suggest, I've just picked up the messages. You weren't seeing my piano, is that right? Could you hear it okay?
Yeah, I could hear it.
You
Yeah,
were in the end. It changed.
Okay.
Nick. It was me that
Okay.
wrote that.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so so Tim, finding the chords behind your melody, I think I would suggest you try and get as consistent as you can with your melody, so you know what the melody notes are, and kind of break it down maybe into phrases. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
So you might have like a 4-bar phrase that you can almost hear in your head without playing it. And then maybe start thinking about, well, okay, so my melody is based on the notes A and C natural. So that gives me access to the chord of A minor because those are both in the A minor chord. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Then also, because you know that you're basing your melody around an A and a C, that also gives you access to an F chord because that F chord has also got an A and a C in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So
Yeah.
if you're concentrating on a melodic starting point, which I'm a big fan of, I have to say, but then I just kind of whistle it into my phone or something, sing it into my phone, and then play it on a loop and try and find the chords to fit it. And I do use technology like that. And if you can do that, then it's great. But it is a bit of a faff to get used to if you're not used to doing that.
That's a good tip. Normally, I just sit there with my guitar and play every chord I know until
until it fits.
Yeah,
We've all done it, man. No, we've all done it. We've all done it. But if you can decide on, in fact, it's quite a useful thing to do to. Part of what I was going to talk about in a bit is the idea of reharmonizing something, and it's quite nice to take a tune you know already. It might be one you've already done, and identify that the main notes in that tune are, like we're saying, an A and a C, possibly a D. Maybe those 3 notes would work quite well. Those 3 notes belong in different kinds of chords. Yeah. So you've got the A minor, the one that we've already talked about. We talked about the F because that's got an A and a C in it, but also D minor seventh has an A and a C in it because you've got the D, the F natural, the A, and the C natural. And if your melody has, if you know what your melody notes are, it's not always a good idea to go with the chord that has the strongest melodic note.
How's the root? Yeah.
Yeah, so use the root somewhere else, exactly that. So it's quite cool to have a melody based around the sixth or the seventh of a chord.
Interesting. Yeah. Thanks, Nick.
Not at all. Anybody else?
Nick, if you don't mind, I might just go back to two things you mentioned and kind of
Yeah.
link them together.
Yeah, please do.
So when you started off, you were talking about what we looked at last time being the rules that got formulated through a particular music tradition.
Yeah.
And one of the things that comes out of that when you follow those steps through in our harmonization technique that I explained last time, you arrive at the diminished chord.
Oh, yeah.
Now, plenty of people who I introduce this to tell me that they've never learnt a song with a diminished chord in it. They've never heard a song with a diminished chord in it. So,
Right.
what am I talking about, and where has
Yeah.
this thing come from, and what's going on? And you mentioned that other traditions use different sets of rules.
Yeah.
And at one point, you pointed out the flattened seventh as
Yeah.
something that's very common in convention. I think it's worth mentioning that in African music and in Irish traditional music, for instance, they don't use the diminished because they put a whole step between the seventh and returning to the root,
Yeah.
which we
Yeah.
call the flattened seventh.
Yeah.
So an awful lot of rock music and pop music in the 60s that really was drawing on those traditions, particularly from skiffle that had its roots in more traditional folk music, and in blues, American blues music that had its roots in African music. There's no diminished. It doesn't exist. What you will have is that last chord, that seventh chord, will be a flattened seventh. So it's more likely that you will have come across that, and your ear might want to lean towards that. So you'll be stepping out of the diatonic rules quite naturally because your ear will tell you, I don't like the sound of that diminished chord. I'm looking for a different sound. And then you will find it. And, you know, if you go back to their first 4 or 5 albums of the Beatles, for instance, wherever there's a seventh chord, it's most likely to be that flattened kind of chord. I'm just trying to think of an example. Maybe A Hard Day's Night's probably a good example.
Yeah.
Where you would expect, if you're following diatonic theory because you're in the key of G, that the F chord that comes pretty early in the chord, in the song and just follows that progression fairly much all the way through, that F will be will have a flat 7 rather than be a diminished chord. And the other, I think, really interesting one that also comes from the Beatles, drawing on particularly a blues tradition, is sometimes when you expect to see the second chord as a minor, they will play it as a major.
As a major, yeah.
And one of the ways that gets really interesting is when you hear in 8 Days a Week, there's a chord with a G sharp. Now I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. I probably should have got this up in front of me when I looked at it. You have I think the second chord is an E major, where you'd expect it to be an E minor.
E minor, yeah.
And then the next chord in the chord progression is a G. So that's got a G natural in it, but the E major has got a G sharp in it. So those are two notes that you might think don't belong in the same key, don't belong in the same song. But it's a really deliberate choice that they will have made to do that, to make the second minor, because they're trying to have the song have a very positive driving energy. And the second being minor is necessarily going to have quite a dark sound. So sometimes when you're breaking the rules, it might be because there's a different convention, a different set of rules that's peeking into the music that you're listening to. And sometimes it might be you just go, that's not the sound I want.
Exactly.
Going minor there is too dark. My song needs to have an energy. I'm going to play a major chord there, even though that diatonic harmonization of the key tells me it should be a minor. If you want a major, you put a major.
Play a major. I think that, yeah, thanks, Scott. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that I'd just like to say something about, I've got a couple of little points about that diminished, the area of the diminished and the devils and intervals and stuff. Can you hear the piano even though you can't see it? Can you hear that? Yep. So I'm not going to bother to flip cameras. It's creating too much hassle. So the diminished in the C, if you listen to the C going up, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, here comes the B diminished. And then we go to the C. It resolves to the C. Now, what a lot of people also do is, and if you think about what makes up that B diminished chord, is a B, a D, and an F, natural. Those are the three top notes of a G7. And you can use the dominant seventh, the seventh of the fifth of the scale, as well as instead of that diminished note. And that will give you this sequence. The 1, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, G7, 1. All right. And it's a kind of softer way of using that same idea of the shape, is to use the fifth chord and its seventh as that kind of like leading chord into the resolution. And as Scott was just also mentioning, the idea of making what is supposed to be minor, major, happens a great deal. So again, that's the diatonic rule, but this that's the 2 with a major chord. There's 8 days a week right there. Yeah. So you're using those major chords instead of the minors. The same is also true the other way down, the other way round. So using the chord 1 and then chord 4, which is an F, and then minorizing that back down to the C. Again, it goes back to what I was saying about moving the note inside the chord rather than feeling as though you've got to shift the whole chord to get to the next thing, to get to the next bit. There are lots of established and fixed kind of chord sequences. We've talked about 1-4-5. We talked about 1-6-4-5. The other one that a lot of people use is what's called the circle of fifths, where you go from C, for example, then back the way you came. What's quite cool is that's not really a circle of fifths at all. it sort of stops when it's convenient. What's quite good is when you actually do the circular fifths all the way down. Sorry, do it properly, do it properly. So the next fifth, yeah, you go from, and find different ways of getting to mess with the resolution. That's what creates the tension. Cool. Anything else that anybody would like me to go back over? Ellie, you've said something about email the notes. If you could see the notes, you really wouldn't want to see them. They're a mess, but I can sort of sharpen them up and send them in if that makes sense.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any terms that you'd like me to go over? Anybody? No? Okay, good. So I just want to sort of round things off a bit. First of all, I've mentioned it, but not very much. Technology is a friend. I know some of us are kind of anxious about it, but it is quite useful to have some kind of recording equipment, either on a phone or in some kind of device somewhere that you can just keep notes on, whether they be little ideas for songs, lyrics, titles, whatever. And please, please, please record all your sessions. Stick your recorder on, play. You'll get lost in try ideas, but keep that recording thing going on your laptop or on your phone or whatever it is. Work out how to use it, because if you go back over it, there will be something that you quite like. You'll hate most of it, but you will like some of it, and that bit is worth hanging on to. It frees you up from trying to remember everything. There are about 3 people in the history of music that I can think of who could write down everything in their head, like, you know, like first time, that's how it goes. Otherwise, as the great Ernest Hemingway said, the first thing you write is always crap. So you do need to kind of move on from whatever it is that you've written and get rid of the things that aren't working and craft it down. It must be said, and in a way, I should really have said this at the beginning. If you've got something you want to write about, then please, please write about it. Don't take any notice of anything that we're saying. If something's coming naturally, then follow that. But if you haven't got anything desperately that you want to sing about or write about, or you've got something that you want to write about, but you haven't quite got an angle on it, then crafting is your friend. Working with bits and working out how they fit together, rather than trying to kind of write the big number straight out of your brain, is really important. Starting with little ideas, little couplets maybe of lyric. Scott's going to talk about that another time. Little ideas for chord sequences, melodic patterns, phrasing, rhythms, riffs, whatever. All this stuff can be kind of like put together to make something that it is more than the sum of its parts, if that makes sense. And the other thing I would like to say is that if you're working from a brief, which you are on this record, it can be quite liberating, because you can kind of concentrate on the brief, come up with the idea of peoples and places and stuff. There are many, many writers in the history of songwriting who wrote fantastic pieces to a brief. Gershwin's one, Cole Porter's another. Any of those amazing writers of the American Songbook were all writing for, let's face it, not particularly high art dance shows, but the music that they were creating, the kind of thing that they were, the orchestrations and the sort of crafting that they were doing, was just sublime, in my opinion, anyway. And that's all to a brief. So it can be quite liberating if you know you're trying to write to a brief. And just a little something on musical expertise, or what I mean, rather more instrumental expertise. If you've got a songwriting tool that you're comfortable with, guitar, piano, drums, whatever, then you use it. And if you've got some nice stuff that you like playing, use that. If you've got a nice little thing you can do on the guitar, or a funky little thing you can do on the bass, or left hand of a piano or something, find a way of holding on to that. There are a lot of songwriters, people like Nina Simone, Richard Thompson, and what have you, who often really excel in their performances because their playing is so fantastic. The songs are just amazing, but their playing is part of their presentation. I'm not suggesting any of us are up there with Simone or Thompson or anyone, but at the same time, if you've got a cool thing you can do on a guitar, or if you've got a cool thing you've got on the bass, then have it, own it, and use it, and kind of like craft it, because it'll be amazing. Yeah. The last thing I was going to say really was I had a really good composition teacher. Okay. Fantastic composition teacher who said to me, you've got to be as good with the scissors as you are with a pencil. And I've just sort of like passed that on. If you've got stuff that you're crafting, don't be afraid to leave it behind. Okay. I know it sounds paradoxical, but if you can cut as well as you can create, you'd be amazed how quickly you sort of like go down into the kind of good bits and go, yeah, that's good, that's great. And keep it simple, keep it straightforward, and it'll be fine. Be really, really cool. I'm sorry if I've kind of gone flying in and around this idea of reharmonization and modes and stuff, but it's as well to be aware of that world, even if you don't want to go anywhere near it, because there might be some ideas in there, or it might be cool to go into a kind of modal weekend and see if you can get your heads around it. So if there are no any questions and no more questions or anything you'd like me to go over, I'm happy to kind of fold it there and maybe open it up for questions or comments.
Anybody?
Thank you, Nick. That was really helpful.
Thank you, Photo. Yeah, I'm sorry if it was a bit all over the place with the tech, but I think we got there.
I just sent you a message in chat how you can do that. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks.
I think that's really useful. I'd like to add drones to the mix a bit more. Those of you who've done some songwriting with me, you know that I love a drone to bounce off. I think that's a really useful way to sort of start melodies and things.
Yeah. It does. It simplifies, or it offers up slightly more opportunities to kind of improvise and play with the idea of a melody around a drone. And if you look into the cultures that have used drones since forever, it's no accident that the melodic writing in those cultures is extraordinary.
Every culture has used drones forever.
Sure.
If you explore it, yeah, they're everywhere. The root and the fifth. They're just that magical combination. And it doesn't direct you to majors or minors or even particularly to different modes, and it doesn't direct you to a time signature.
That's right. It just opens it up.
Slows you down. And if you haven't got a drone machine but you've got an old keyboard, you can just get a bit of gaffer tape.
Yeah, exactly.
And hold the keys down with gaffer tape, the two notes, and you have your drone going.
Or work out what key your vacuum cleaner's in.
I like that. Yeah.
Or the washing machine or something.
Anyway, that was very interesting. Thank you.
We should also probably mention in passing that, particularly on guitar, there's a tradition of dispensing with major and minor altogether and playing these things called power chords, which is just the root and the fifth.
Yeah.
And possibly the root, the fifth, and the octave.
Yeah.
And you can ignore major and minor altogether and just spell out the root notes that you want to hear in your song. You can use them for the whole song, or you can use them just for a chord here and there where you're not sure if you want a major or minor sound and you'd rather just ignore it. You can do that. And you can also do the same as that might be from a punk or heavy metal tradition. You can also go the way of a blues tradition and play all the chords as a dominant seventh and just completely forget about whether they're minor or major. Those will just give you some different flavors that you can try.
The power chord is a really interesting thing for me, because going back to what I was saying right at the beginning about the history of all that harmony, one of the best, one of the rules that's absolutely drilled into you as you learn harmony, in inverted commas, is no parallel fifths and no parallel octaves. Rubbish, actually. As soon as you hit the chord, as soon as you hit a power chord, you go, give me parallel fifths anytime, because they really, really work.
I
Yeah,
don't
no,
call them power chords. I call them power drones.
yeah, well, you might be right.
That's what they are. They're just power drones. And
Um,
the other
Cool.
thing is, if you've got a guitar, you can just whack it into an open tuning, make one
Yeah,
up, and then you can explore a lot of stuff that you're suddenly able to find sounds that have a flavor of
mm,
maybe Arabic sound, but without
yeah.
necessarily knowing what you're doing.
No, I think the tuning thing, I've got a page on tuning which I didn't go into, and I think it's a really interesting addition to the idea of drones and dulcimer music. And you know, you're not far from there into people like Joni Mitchell and Joan Armatrading and stuff, who are using those tunings to get really interesting kind of harmonic bases to write melody from. It's really good, I
Yeah.
think.
Nick Drake.
Yeah,
yes, absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
So we've gone way over time, so we should probably wind it up there. I think everybody's got a good 2 weeks to explore all of the ideas that we've covered in these 2 sessions so far. Again, we will put up a video of this session. Don't worry, Nick, I will edit out the bits where
The
you're
rubbish.
getting the technology to work. And we'll send out whatever notes Nick can get together, and we will be back in 2 weeks' time for a discussion on the lyric side of songwriting, rather cheekily entitled "Lyrics, Do They Matter?" And we'll take that as a provocation to get started on. I can see Ellie's got a question just before we wind up.
Hi, sorry to quickly just throw in a last minute question. I had to process what I wanted to ask. I wanted to go back to sort of nearer the start where Nick, you talked about tempo.
Yeah,
So I wanted to so for me, what I find difficult is that I find it hard to know what tempo to set my songs to, as I don't work to a particular genre necessarily. I just like to experiment and be experimental with it.
hmm
And usually I work to the 120 BPM tempo that Logic Pro X like comes up with usually, like when you open
yeah,
the new project.
yeah,
It's because I want to get my ideas down really quickly because they're flowing quite quickly. So I'm not necessarily thinking about the tempo per se, but I'm obviously thinking about what it sounds like as a beat and if it works. And I guess I just wanted to know how you would like what you would say if this is okay, or if this is something, because I would like to work on this and kind of try to understand it a bit better.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
First of all,
suggest.
yes, it's okay. And second of all, when you open your Logic sessions, or when you
Yeah,
have your kind of sketchbook ready, as it were,
yeah.
do you switch the metronome on?
I do, yeah, I do. If I'm like,
Well,
yeah,
stop doing that for a start. So you just work with kind of like freehand out of your head. It won't help you
yeah,
recording. It won't help you then in the next stage. But if
yeah,
you've got a sketchbook with rough ideas, with no tempo predetermined,
yeah,
no drum loop, nothing, just you kind of whistling or singing or
mm,
la-di-dying onto the tape, I was going to say,
yeah,
into the machine, then it's not being restricted by any
yeah,
given preset.
yeah,
You can always go back to it and go, well, that was bit needs to go much and then you can craft that tempo or craft the feel from what you naturally did, rather than trying to force what you want to do into the
Yeah,
tempo
so
that's already set.
yeah, because I don't start out with like using the metronome. I only
Okay.
will use that sometimes if I, you know, say I've
Okay.
got a few instruments down and I want to add
Yeah. Okay.
something.
Okay, so in that case, what I would suggest is that you kind of take a breath between each time you want to put your ideas in. Don't get caught up with the technology, just send
Yeah,
the stuff into it and then
yeah.
go back over it at the end of the afternoon or the night or whatever. And don't really listen to anything until you've kind of finished doing your sketches.
Yeah.
Because you'll end up trying to overthink it, on my guesses.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Anyway, we can
That-
talk about that another time, Ellie. We'll talk
Yeah.
about
Thank
That's
you.
a good approach, Nick. One technological tip for Logic Pro X is that you can highlight the tempo just using your mouse or your trackpad or whatever, and that activates tap tempo, which is where it will pick up the tempo you're tapping with and set the tempo of the session to match that. And you do that once you got that highlighted just by tapping the T key. So if you've got an idea in your head, you're not sure how fast or slow it is, highlight the tempo display and just tap a T key, and it will work out what speed you're tapping it at and change the tempo to that.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Any last
Thanks, everybody.
questions, or should we wind it up? I think that's it. Okay,
Great.
so we'll see everybody in 2 weeks, and thanks very much, Nick. I think you've taken where we were at and expanded us out in all sorts of different directions, and I'm sure everyone has got something they can't wait to get back on their instrument to try.
Yeah, great.
Thanks for coming, everyone. See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks very much.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.